All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick Strength and Power. So in this video, I want to talk about a bodybuilder named Thierry Pastel. So this was a guy who I believe kind of exemplified almost the opposite of what we see with bodybuilding today and what we deem to be kind of the issue with bodybuilding today. So a lot of the main complaint that people have with today's bodybuilders is the whole bubble gut phenomenon, where they have these big bloated GH guts, they like to call them. They got these big, just distended bellies on stage. So we look back at a bodybuilder like Thierry Pastel, and he had one of the best sets of abs that I think I've ever seen on a bodybuilding stage, just in terms of the sheer development of the abs, the size, the prominence, how much they stick out, the serratus leading into the shape of the abdominal muscles. Like, it's just overall, the aesthetics of his waistline was just absolutely incredible. But not only was Thierry Pastel known for his amazing set of abdominals, but his arms were some of the best arms, in my opinion, in the history of bodybuilding. For a bodybuilder, in terms of pound for pound size, his arms relative to the rest of his physique were just absolutely incredible. They weren't too big, they weren't too small. They were the perfect size, and they had the perfect flow with the rest of his physique. And I think really, when you talk about the best body part on a bodybuilder, you can't really just isolate that body part and not take into account how it looks compared to the rest of their body. So being as small as Thierry Pastel was, he was commonly under 200 pounds on stage. He only stood about 5'2", so he was a very, very short bodybuilder. So in terms of sheer mass and size, he wasn't, this big crazy mass monster, but his biceps were certainly rivaling some of the guys' biceps that were much, much bigger than him, just because they looked so good on his frame. So primarily, Thierry competed in the late 80s and the early 1990s. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of information about what he's doing now. There's really not a whole lot of information about him in general, because honestly, he wasn't that big of a bodybuilder in terms of overall popularity at that time. As you know, the early 90s kind of ushered in the era of the mass monster, with Dorian Yates winning his first Mr. Olympia back in 1992. And at that same 1992 Mr. Olympia, Thierry Pastel placed in 10th place. So you could tell there was definitely a shift in what the judges were looking for. They were starting to look more at overall muscle mass and a little bit less in terms of aesthetics and just sheer, just having good lines. They were starting to look at guys that just had overall mass. So outside of the IFBB in 1984, 1986, and 1987, Thierry Pastel won the WABBA World Championships. And the WABBA was an organization founded by Serge Nubret. Some of you guys may remember him from the 1975 docudrama Pumping Iron, where he competed against Arnold Schwarzenegger and placed second at the 1975 Mr. Olympia. But Serge Nubret would go on to start his own bodybuilding organization at WABBA, and the WABBA World Championships was the most prestigious show of that organization. It was kind of like their Mr. Olympia. So Thierry Pastel won that competition 3 times. He also competed in the NABA Mr. Universe competition, but he would never win that show, and his best placing at the Universe would be a 4th place finish. So Thierry really began his IFBB career in earnest in 1989, where he would compete in a slew of these Grand Prix competitions: the Grand Prix Holland, the Grand Prix France, Germany, Spain, Sweden, etc., etc. So this was one of those guys, although he didn't compete for a long time in terms of how many years he competed, he probably competed, just over a decade, probably 10 to 15 years was the entirety of his competitive career. It looks like the 1995 IFBB Grand Prix Ukraine was his last competition. He started bodybuilding around 84, 83. So right around 12 years. But despite the fact he didn't compete for a very long time, he competed very, very frequently. So I'm looking at his list of competitions here between 1989 and 1995, and I see somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 plus competitions on this list. Like I said, competing in all those Grand Prix. So he looks like he was a guy that competed year-round, stayed in shape year-round, and never went crazy in the off-season in terms of trying to put on a bunch of size and a bunch of muscle. He was definitely a guy that was focusing on being conditioned, being aesthetic, and just having good flow, lines, and aesthetics. So I would say 1991 was probably one of the best competitive years for Thierry Pastel in terms of overall placings at relatively big shows. And after 1991, his placings would begin to slip a little bit. So at the 1991 Olympia, he would place 8th, and that would be his best Olympia finish. He would place 4th at the Grand Prix Italy, 4th at the Grand Prix Denmark, 3rd at the Pittsburgh Pro, 4th at the Night of Champions, 5th at the prestigious Arnold Classic, and 4th at the Ironman Pro. So a lot of top 6 finishes there at relatively big bodybuilding shows. He would continue to compete in several Grand Prix after those shows as well, placing in the top 6 at all of those. Then, as I mentioned earlier, he would compete in the 1992 Mr. Olympia, where he would place 10th. Then his final Olympia appearance would be in 1994, where he would place 14th. So his placings were gradually slipping. And in terms of, bodybuilding's greatest stage, the Olympia, he never really got the recognition that I think he deserved. He was a very, very impressive bodybuilder, but I think he came along at kind of the wrong time. The shift, like I said, was going towards mass, and Thierry was a guy, number one, he was very short, so he was very easily overlooked on the bodybuilding stage. He wasn't very heavy. Again, like I said, he was frequently under 200 pounds on stage, so that's another reason he got overlooked. But if you look at him on his own and all these pictures that I'm showing you, this guy is arguably one of the most impressive, most aesthetic, and just most pleasing to look at bodybuilders that I've ever seen. I mean, again, his abs, his serratus muscles, his front double bicep, just the shape of the peak of his bicep, absolutely incredible, extremely underrated bodybuilder. And I think if he had came along maybe at a different time, he would have been much more well-known and much more famous as a bodybuilder for the physique that he was able to bring to the stage. So please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.